All right, so we are really excited to have you all here. I also want to point out that we do have 2 ASL interpreters with us today. We want to make sure that folks are aware. We will be pausing at times as needed. We might offer reminders about slowing down to make sure the interpreters are able to track everything. And want to make sure that if anyone has any questions or technical issues, feel free to message Miranda or I in the chat. You all also have the option to use the closed captioning button at the bottom where it says live transcript. You can turn that on if you would like to. You can also select what size of captions you would like if that's helpful for you. In terms of participation, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to have, we're going to be using the chat at times, but you also have the ability to mute and unmute yourselves. So please be thoughtful of that. If you aren't speaking, feel free to mute yourselves. If we hear background noise, we'll make sure we can go in and maybe mute someone if we hear some background noise, but making sure that you are all,
Hi. Where did Ruby go away? Do you know?
Elaine, would you mind muting yourself?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. All right, so see, perfect example. So just want to give you all that heads up because we want to make sure that if you do want to share something verbally, that you have the option. So we want this training to be really participatory and make sure everybody feels as connected as possible. So those are our technical announcements, and ultimately, we want to just say that, here at Violence Free Colorado, we are super excited to have Cathy, who is the Senior Training Consultant from the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. She's with us today for the Accessible, Culturally Responsive, and Trauma-Informed ACRTI Supervisory Training Series. So I'm going to turn it over to Cathy for more introductions and more great information. Thanks, Cathy.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. Again, technology is a little dicey today, so we'll do as best we can. Things that will be helpful for you for our time together is, I know that all of the handouts were sent out to everyone. We will be using those handouts when we have conversations, when we have breakouts. And so I'll try to give you a heads up around what we'll be using first, just so you can be prepared on your end. If you didn't get the handouts, let Brandy or Miranda know and they can send them out again. And other than that, I think we'll just go ahead and get started. I'm going to screen share. So bear with me one moment. Oops. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. So when I talk about effective supervisory practice, there really are a host of things that we need to think about as leaders. So for today's training, well, this is recorded as Brandy shared. It's an overview of all of the things that we're going to talk about in terms of supervision and what's effective, how to be transparent, really thinking about skills that we as leaders need to have and use in our interactions with the folks that we supervise. I think core to all of the conversation is really thinking about what does it mean to create a supervisory structure and practice that is accessible, that is culturally responsive, that feels respectful, that feels that power is shared, and that we're also thinking about the impacts of trauma on everyone. So the survivors we support and the staff who are doing the work. So all of these things come together. There are also some additional resources that I may mention along the way. And what we'll do is make note of those things, because sometimes those additional resources come up in response to a question or an idea that pops into my head, or something that, a comment from any of the participants. So we will be responsive in that way, and I'll say, oh yeah, there's this thing. Let me make sure you get that. So I may name some things. We'll make sure that we provide the links and get them to you. And they'll go out with the materials for our next session. So you'll always have everything that I've mentioned, and you'll always have what we're going to use in advance. And so along those lines, the first handout we're going to use is, I think at the top it says values activity. And so to make sure that you have that handy. Okay. So the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health is FIPSA funded, and the opinions and material that's presented today is not necessarily a reflection of the beliefs of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And what we do at the National Center is we do training in TA, research and evaluation, policy development and analysis, and public awareness. I want to talk a little bit about the framework that we use, and then we'll have some deeper conversation about what that might mean. So this graphic really speaks to what it means for us at the center to be accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma informed. And so what it means is that we're holding all of these pieces. So there's being trauma informed, which is knowing that the folks that we encounter in our work, and many of us have experiences with violence and trauma, and that there are many sources of trauma, and holding all of those perspectives and experiences as we do our work together and as we work with survivors. So we're always holding what we know and what we've learned in terms of domestic and sexual violence and the skills and practices of our advocacy. Being trauma informed does not replace our advocacy, it enhances it. And then when we're thinking about that, what we also know is that because of the experiences that individuals have, that communities have, that cultural groups have, that folks experience in the present and in history, we know that we also need to hold a human rights and social justice context to everything that we do. And so what it means is that we're never just saying, oh, you've had this experience, this is what we need to do. What we're saying is, based on the experiences that you've had, how can we best partner to support you to do what you want to do next? And then how do we carry that set of practices into supervision, as well as having it in our services? The inside circle speaks to what it means to center survivor's voice. And so survivor defined means we do nothing without survivors saying, this is what I'm choosing. I want this, I'm selecting this. That we leverage and elevate physical and emotional safety, and we'll talk quite a bit about that. That all of what we do is centered on a belief that people are resilient, survivors are resilient, we are each resilient, and we can be hopeful in that resilience. And then making sure that we have relationship and connection. So this is particularly important in supervision, in that without relationship between a supervisor and staff, and so I'm going to use those labels because it's easier to define what we're talking about and who we're talking about. So if you're supervising people, if you are leading people, then the supervisor title is for you in our conversation today. If you are supervised by someone, if there's the relationship between these two positions that feels safe, that feels comfortable, that feels supportive, then it works well. If that relationship is contentious, then there are some of the skills that we talk about today that will not be available to you as a supervisor because the relationship is untrustworthy or unsafe or it's new. And so I'm going to talk about that in detail as we continue our conversation. There is a document that I will make sure that you get that describes all of the pieces for this framework. I am not sure that I sent that in the handouts.
Cathy, I don't think that we sent out the toolkit.
Great. So 2 things. You will get the toolkit. You will also, in the document that I'm thinking about is in the appendix of the toolkit, but it also is a standalone, so I will make sure that that comes to you tomorrow, for sure. Okay. So to get us started, I'd like to just, first of all, make sure that you have snacks, that you have drinks, that you are feeling comfortable in your seat, in your space that you're in. You are welcome to drink beverages, have snacks. One of the things I have near me is lotion. And so it smells like it's a mango grapefruit, so it smells really good. And you may, if you can see me on screen, you may see me put lotion on my hands. So what are the things that you do that help you feel grounded and centered and connected? Things that help you press pause. So here's what I know. Every single one of us has a massively busy schedule. So I feel honored and I feel a great appreciation for the time that you're taking to be here. And what I would ask you to do is do everything you can that helps you stay focused and be present. I also would invite you to be on camera if you would like.
Cathy, can I interrupt just for 1 second?
Absolutely, yes.
So due to our technical setup today, so we had some glitches that we realized. One of the things that would be most helpful for the ASL interpretation would actually be if, while the slides are being presented, if folks could be off camera, because
okay.
then Sabrina, who's accessing the ASL, interpreters can actually find them because we don't have that pinning capacity, the multi-pin capacity set up. Would that be okay for today?
Sure, sure. The question would be when we're in small group.
Absolutely, absolutely. So in small groups.
And so that would be something to think about.
Yes, in small
but
groups.
Absolutely, thank you for asking. Of course.
So yes,
of course,
if you all wouldn't mind, again, this is on us in terms of the way that we had set something up incorrectly. So our goal is going to be, for moving forward, we will have the ability to have everybody on camera. And unfortunately, we just don't have that today. So if you wouldn't mind turning off your cameras until we get to small groups, the breakout rooms, that way then the interpreters are going to be more visible. Thank you all so much.
You're very welcome. And thank you for bringing that up. So what I want us to think about then is, again, what you can best do for your comfort and for your care. And I'd like to open a breathing exercise. So the way this works, it's called a spiral breath. And so you see on the screen, there's a fern. What I'd like you to do is you can either trace with your eyes or trace with your finger, that's up to you. But to start at the bottom of that stem and breathe in. And as you breathe in, trace the shape of that fern around the top edge, around the circle to the inside point. And then when you exhale, start at that inside tip and trace back around to the edge. So inhale, trace the fern around to the inside. Exhale, trace from the inside, back around the edge to the bottom. Let's do one more. Inhale, Trace from the bottom of the fern, around the circle to the tip. Exhale from the inside, back around to the bottom. Along our time together, if you need to stand up and stretch, please do. We will take a break at a midpoint for 15 minutes so that you'll have an opportunity to take a bio break or get beverage, whatever it is you need to do. And again, just if there's anything that comes up for you during our time together where you'd like to share your opinion or perspective, answer a question, you can again either unmute yourself and respond, or you can put stuff in the chat. What I'd like to ask folks to put in the chat right now, if there's anything that you regularly do to press pause during your workday, to relax during your workday, to clear your mind, to switch gears from one appointment to the next or one task to the next, and go ahead and put that in the chat. If everybody would add that, that would be awesome. So it's adding your go-to strategy. Pressing pause is the language I use, and I know folks use lots of different words to talk about it. And sometimes, particularly in this field, there's a perspective that the stakes are so high for survivors that I can't take a break. And what I would offer is that we are much better with and for survivors when we do take a break, take care of our own needs. And then when we show up in our relationships and interactions with folks, we're bringing our best selves. We're better able to center ourselves, to focus on, the challenge or the issue or the need that's in front of us, and to do the work that we intend to do in the ways that we intend to do it. Love it. So some of these I can see, so I'm going to just notice. Coffee and music, two of my favorite things. Standing stretch, music, lotion, love it. A small altar, just love it. Getting air, yes, get out, get air. Cool, Nordic ski on a lunch break, love that. One of the stories that I learned from a supervisor in Colorado when we did this in-person training, and that supervisor invited staff to bring, spare boots, extra shoes, so that when you need a break and can take a break, just change your shoes and go on outside. And, I love that. And that's an activity that I actually share with folks all across the country because it makes so much sense to me to get outside, to breathe, do something physical, drink water, have a snack. Yeah, thanks for sharing, everyone. So no small thing, this self-care. And one of the pieces that I would ask us to think about, as we're having this training today and in a future series, to make sure that you are thinking about the importance of self-care, and that it's not just a responsibility for individual staff. So we have to model it as accountable leaders. We have to support staff by organizational strategies. So we can't burden people so much and then say, oh, by the way, go take care of yourself. We have to make it possible in our organizations. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. I'd like you to think for a moment about the best supervisory experience that you have ever had, and just to hold that experience in your mind and in your heart. And what I'd like you to hold on to as you think about that is, in your work, how do you create or recreate that best supervisory experience for the folks that you encounter in your day-to-day? So whether it's a direct supervisory link, or if you are the executive director in an organization, and there are layers of hierarchy, which exist in many of our organizations. And so there are things we may try to do to flatten that hierarchy, but we also need to know and acknowledge that it exists. And so there's all kinds of things we can do as leaders to be more inclusive, to operate with less and less and less and less power over others. But we do need to acknowledge that when there is a hierarchy, we need to name it. If you don't work in a collective, you work in a hierarchy. So really thinking about the impact of that. So part of the conversation is really linking what are the things that made your supervisory experience wonderful, and also to notice that when you've had terrible supervisory experiences, what were those things, and to make sure those are not things we repeat. So the best supervisory experience I ever had, someone noticed very early on that I had leadership skills that I could use in my current seat. And that person, actually two different supervisors, used every opportunity to both acknowledge those leadership skills and to promote me to use them and encourage me to use them. And in both of those positions, I started those jobs in a direct service capacity, and within 6 months, I was a supervisor of those programs, and eventually the director of those two programs. And so that was the gift, that those folks saw something that at times I myself didn't recognize, and they said those things to me out loud. So we're going to talk about being strength-based. And when you see a strength, you need to name it and say it to the person, because that's what we can do to acknowledge the good qualities that we see. It's one of those strategies. The very worst supervisor I ever had talked a lot about values and our mission statement and the ways that we all needed to show up and do the work, and then treated individual staff terribly, was disrespectful, was cruel, said really unkind things in very public spaces, and called people out in ways that was shaming and harmful. And so even as I'm sharing that experience, and it happened well over 20 years ago, I can still feel that in my chest as I talk about it and what that disconnection was like. And so the good lasts and the good stays, but the negative also lasts and also stays. So we're going to talk about supervision in a way that it's scaffolding, it's the structure, it's the backbone of the relationships that we have in our work. And so when those relationships are good and clear, they're strong, we're transparent, everyone knows what to expect, there's not a lot of hidden surprises that jump out and undermine people. That's when it works and works well. When we have trust, it works well. When people feel comfortable and feel that supervisors are trustworthy, it works well. And so those are the things that we're going to talk about as the ingredients of effective supervision. So my colleague Michael and Michael was my supervisor twice. So his name is here for this reason. And we were coming back from a conference, probably in 1995. And I said to him, "You can't be the boss of me." And, we then worked as colleagues and created a training business together. And to this day, work as very close partners. And when we talked about what good supervision was, this is what we came up with. It's a reliable relationship. So again, if it's not reliable, if it's not consistent, then that's not helpful. And what happens in that relationship is the capacity for support, capacity for learning, and the capacity for growing in whatever position we're in. It is not parenting, it's not therapy, and it is not authoritarian. And so it doesn't mean that we're never directive, but we can be directive without being authoritarian. And so it's the balance of things, it's the balance of that skill that we're bringing into a supervisory space. If you are viewing the people that you interact with in your work as, a friend of mine once described it as a higher level of parenting, then those relationships are not the right relationships for supervisory practice. We're not parenting. And I think the other challenge is, especially as many of us who are doing this work may have clinical experience or clinical degrees or education, that this is not a therapeutic relationship. It can feel supportive, it can be calming, it can be clarifying. But if you find yourselves in a therapeutic alliance with someone that you're supervising, and it's not clinical supervision, that's not the purpose, then that also can be a misstep in supervision. And so there's a line that we're walking here around values and behavior and the skills that we need to practice so that we see the folks we supervise as adults, that we see them as capable, that we see them as capable of growing and learning, and capable of doing the job they're doing with the amount of support and direction they might need. And so those are the things we're going to be unpacking in our conversation. Just wanted to pause and see if there were any questions or comments. All right. So there are three functions to supervision. And this is based on the work of Alfred Kadushin, who wrote, books and chapters and all kinds of things. And so what I like to pull from all of that is that in our supervision, in those relationships, we are providing education. So the educative function is really about training and teaching and coaching to make sure that folks have an opportunity to learn skills and develop in their roles. As a leader, you might not be providing all of that direct education, but you are going to make sure that it happens. We need to make sure that it happens. So the function of education might be that in our staff meetings, we're taking some time to educate people, to teach people, to show people how to do something as a whole group. We might be doing that education in our one-on-one supervision. And so I do have a bias, and my bias is this, that every staff person is deserving of individual supervision. And so what that looks like is that someone in a supervisory capacity provides one-on-one supervision at least once a week. If you are supervising so many people that that's not possible, then you might have to shift and make it every other week. But if we make it too long, too far apart, then we're not attending to those education and skill development needs that staff have. So my bias is each person once a week. Now, some people need a half an hour, some people need an hour. And so thinking about how you structure that is up to you and what you know about each staff person's skills, about their communication styles. Some people need a long time to tell a story. I'm one of those. Other people can just get to the point, ask their questions, and we're done here. And so it's knowing staff, it's learning how they operate best, and then providing what they need. The second function of supervision is support. And support is exactly what it sounds like. It's how do we put our skills together, our talents together, our passions together, our compassion, our empathy, and bring that to the supervisory conversation. And what I'm going to ask folks to think about in a moment is how much time do you spend in each of these functions? So support is the feel-good part of the supervisory relationship. How we help people navigate the challenges in their day. How do we support them through, maybe there's interactions with survivors that don't go well. Maybe there's interactions with colleagues that don't go well. You know, that's the space for that conversation. And then the third function is the administrative role. That's the timesheets, grant writing, all the things we do to make sure the doors stay open and services stay possible. And so all of those functions together are what needs to happen in supervision. So for each of you, if you think about your time as 100%, what percentage of your time do you spend in each of these functions? And go ahead and please put that in the chat. And so for anyone who thinks you have more than 100% of your time, I just want to tell you that we sometimes push ourselves way beyond what we're capable of and can be exhausted in the process. So think about it as I only have 100% during my work time. So in your supervision, how much education, how much support, how much administration do you provide? And if anyone would like to share that out, that would be great. 15 to 20 on education. Thank you, Teresa. 30, 50, 20. Great, thank you. 40, 45. Cool, thank you so much. So these are some really good examples of what this can look like for us. And so the challenge I have for you, and I would ask that, you know, over your next week or so to pay attention and notice. For those of you who are providing not a lot of time in the education function, but you're providing a lot in support, what that may signal is that staff might need a little bit more on the education piece. So sometimes people need more support because they don't feel confident in their skills. And we'll talk a lot about competencies and skill development during our time together. Others of you may be spending the bulk of your time in administration because if you're the executive director, that's one of your very primary functions is to keep things going and moving. And so making sure that if that's true, that there are others in supervisory roles that can be helpful in terms of staff support and education. So it's looking for this balance that's important because we need to have all three of these functions. One of the things that happens with support is because it feels good that many of us lean into that. And, you know, hands up, I'm definitely one of those folks. I love supporting people in the supervisory relationship. And what that means is that I have to notice for myself that, oh, wait, there are administrative things that I haven't quite gotten to and need to do. Or there's an education piece that I need to make sure staff are getting. Okay. Any other thoughts or comments? And I see the conversation around interns absolutely makes so much sense that education would be key there, right? Makes a lot of sense. So thank you for that. On the screen in front of you are the list of effective supervisory ingredients. And so this too came out of the relationship that I had with wonderful supervisors and with a colleague who, again, was my supervisor twice. And then we shifted this experience using situational leadership and really focusing in on staff development. So I'm going to do a quick review of what each of these ingredients are. So first is values. And so they are in this order because of the way that we need to link every single ingredient. Everything we do in supervision comes back to values and ethics. Everything. And so values is at the top for exactly that reason. So if we think about our advocacy, if we think about access, if we think about being survivor defined and trauma informed, these are examples of the values that we have. And in particular, if we're talking about doing anti-racism work and elevating survivor defined supports, then those are the values that we need to name, we need to talk about it, we need to make sure that staff are aware. So often, what can happen is folks will have their, excuse me, folks will have, join an organization, you get your policy handbook, and you have a conversation about mission, vision, and values. And you sign sometimes that you even got this handbook, and then it goes in a drawer and you never take it out until there's a crisis. And so what we want to do in our work is make sure that the values are living and breathing, and that even when we're giving people feedback, we're linking that back to the values that we hold. When we think about values and ethics, individuals have values and ethics. If you are doing this work, there's professional values and ethics, and that may come from your education, may come from your experience. And then there's the values and ethics in our organizations as a whole. And that sometimes those things are in agreement and sometimes they're in conflict. The next ingredient is focused on being strength-based and how we need to look for strengths and name strengths directly to the person, followed by a problem-solving or a solution-focused orientation, so that when folks have challenges and they come to supervision, or you as a supervisor are talking with someone because a challenge has come up, we want to engage staff as a partner in finding solutions, rather than just saying, here, go do this, fix it this way. We want to engage staff in that conversation. And so we need to have strategies to do that. We want to make sure we have clear expectations, that people know their roles, they know what supervision looks like, what the structure will be, when is their time. Many of us have an open door policy. What I will say about open door policies is that they often are not available or accessible to someone who is fearful, for someone who is uncomfortable, for someone who's not sure of their skills, for someone who is worried about how they're being perceived by colleagues, for someone who's struggling in their home life, for someone who's struggling in their work life. And so we can say, yes, we have an open door, but it's only open and available to someone if they are able to walk through it. And so if they can't enter in that way, then only having an open door policy means we are missing interactions with anyone who is not feeling capable of stepping towards that door. And so we've got to be thinking about that, right? And what makes that possible? And how is it that everyone is comfortable to step through it? And we don't know. So as we think about our roles, as we think about the kinds of environments we create, it's important for us to consider that a different strategy might be helpful. We need to make sure that people know the skills and the competencies, that they have job descriptions, they know what's expected of them. And often we talk about that and we focus on it in the hiring process, but then we lack that clarity as we move forward. And so noticing that, paying attention to that. We're going to talk about accountability, both accountable leadership and accountability for staff and people who are being supervised. Accountable leadership also means that as leaders, we model competence. So if we know what we want staff to do, if we know how we want folks to interact, then we need to model that and give that back to folks. Feedback is a topic that we are going to cover in our very first follow-up session. And so we'll cover it, briefly today, but we will talk about strategies for how to give feedback and how to receive feedback, but also how to provide staff with an orientation to giving and receiving feedback. Situational leadership is an ingredient that we use for staff development. We will focus another session on just situational leadership and staff development and support and providing direction and doing that in a way that meets staff where they really are rather than where we wish they were. And then the final ingredient is reflective practice. So we'll talk about reflection in our third follow-up session. So the way that this works is when you look at all these ingredients, you can use most of these ingredients at any point in time. You can use most of these ingredients when you're not sure of staff, you don't know them really well, you're still learning about them. You can use most of these ingredients even when there's a situation where you're giving staff critical feedback. Sometimes in our role as leaders, there's disciplinary action that takes place where folks are given critical feedback, but also given notice that the behavior, whatever it was problematic, given clear direction on how that needs to shift or change. The only one that when the relationship is not trustworthy, we cannot use reflective practice. And so when we have our follow-up session on reflection, we'll talk a lot more about that. But I just want you to have a heads up that these are skills that we can use and incorporate in all of our work. If you would, prepare to use the handout. We're going to talk about values. And the handout is a values activity. And it will say that at the top. And the instructions for the value activity is this. We're going to take about 3 minutes. So I don't want you to overthink this. Use the first response that comes to mind. So for each item on your list, you're going to put in an A if it's always important, an S if it's sometimes important, and an N if it's never important. So we're going to take that 3 minutes right now to just very quickly go through that checklist. And again, A for always, S for sometimes, N for never. And go ahead and do that right now. And then we're going to get into breakout groups and have a conversation. And I just set my timer. And Billy, the list was sent out with the handouts. And they went out in an email to everyone.
Yes, so those, so no one has been assigned to a room yet, just to clarify. You're all doing this activity individually right now. And then in terms of the handouts, those handouts were all sent out. Some were sent out on Friday, some were sent out on Monday for some folks. Should have been sent out by the latest yesterday. If for some reason you did not get a handout email from me, please let me know that in the chat and I will make sure you get that. But I thought we got them to everyone, but apologies if something happened.
Thanks, Brandy. So again, don't overthink it. What your first thought that comes to mind is going to be the right answer for you. We have a little less than half a minute. All right.
All right, if anybody doesn't have the handouts or needs them emailed again, if you wouldn't mind putting that in the chat and then I will go ahead and send them. I see that there's 2 folks who need that. So I'm gonna put you all in breakout rooms in a second and then I'll be able to email it. So apologies, there'll be a little lag on that.
Okay, thanks, Brandy. And then for everyone in your breakout rooms, what you're going to do is have a conversation about the things that are always important. So if anything you put an A next to, I want you to have a conversation about that. And so you'll have, in your breakout groups, you'll have about 6 minutes, and then we're going to come back and talk about it. Brandy, go ahead, and whenever you're ready, go ahead and put folks into group.
All right, I just need to set a little timer for 6 minutes. Once you all get in there, you should all automatically go into the groups. And if for some reason you don't end up in a group, we'll make sure that we'll send you somewhere because we'll see that you're hanging out here still. Yep. All right, looks like everybody landed. I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording while we're in breakout rooms.
All right, welcome back, everyone. So one of the things I wanted to check in with you about is to notice, right? There are individual values that we have. So there's personal beliefs that I carry into my work, and that is true for each and every one of us. And then there's the organizational policies and practices that align with our work and align with how we want to be at work, really where we feel like, you know, we've made this connection. And then there are possible disconnections. And so I wonder in your conversations around values that are always important, did anyone have anything that you wanted to share about that conversation or about your experience? So you don't have to comment. I was just wondering if anyone wanted to comment about that experience. You can either put something in the chat or unmute yourself and share. Was there anything in that list that anyone had a strong reaction to?
You know, for myself, this is Simone, and a couple of others in my group, we talked about the be obeyed by others. Just that word obeyed felt strong and more of a power over versus a shared power language.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's there on intention, because I think, you know, sometimes where we get caught up is that we want to be power sharing, especially in our, given our role, given this work, given what we know and understand in this work about power and the misuse of power, that there are also days when, you know, as human beings, we may want someone to just do what we just said, right? And could you not question, could you not do? And then here, again, that where the disconnection is that we hire and support and need advocates to do this work. We hire folks intentionally to be outspoken, to be collaborative, to say what they mean what they say, to use the voices they have on behalf of our organizations and the people that we support in the work. And then when that advocacy and activism is presented and directed at a supervisor, then we often can struggle with that. And so while it may not be always important to be obeyed, and we might hate that word, and it feels so very much power over, there are times when as human beings, we step into that space. And so it's to be aware, to notice what your always things are, or the things that are never important until they are. And to recognize that when we have time to reflect on what's important in the ways that we're showing up, what's important in the ways that as a leader, that I'm responding to the people around me. And if I have an edge and I'm tired, or if I'm busy, I'm preoccupied, or there's a crisis and I need to deal with crisis and other things need to wait, how am I speaking to others in those moments? How am I still conveying to folks that I see them worthy of great dignity, great respect? I see them as whole human beings. And recognize that there are times when I, as a leader, don't show up in the way that I want others to show up, or in the ways that I want to show up myself. And also to hold that there are times when there's a disconnection in the values, my own, or in any individual that I work with, any individual staff, any survivor that we support. There may be a clash of values in this work, and there are possible disconnections. So I wanted to just pause a minute and see if folks had any thoughts or other thoughts or comments, and thank you for that. One of the things that I would encourage each and every one of you to do is as you're thinking about each staff person, think about and even talk directly with them about the values that they bring into their work, to notice the organizational policies and practices that align with that staff person's beliefs and values, and possible disconnections. Something that I hear very frequently from supervisors and from leaders in all kinds of roles is that when staff are struggling, one of the things that they'll hear from staff say, or that they know staff are saying to one another, is, I'm the only person who cares about doing this right. I'm the only person who cares about doing trauma-informed work. Nobody else here is doing trauma-informed work. No one else is thinking about the impacts of racism. No one else is thinking about how power is used in our services. No one else is doing the things in the right way. And so when staff are feeling that disconnection, it often leads to or contributes to or is a signal of burnout, because staff are not experiencing that connection of values if they're thinking that they're the only one. Any thoughts, questions, or comments before moving forward? Okay. So if we're holding that these are all things we intend to do and intend to be, intentionally be anti-racist, really focus on being healing-centered, being equitable, not judging, making sure that we're culturally grounded, not just responding to the person, but acknowledging that our organization has a culture and that the people we serve each have their own individual identities and cultural experiences. And can we adapt? So we intend to be this way. We intend to be trustworthy. We intend to balance and name and notice where we have formal authority. So in a hierarchical organization, leaders do have formal authority. So again, to act as if it doesn't exist isn't helpful, but to name it as, yes, it exists, and this is how I'm going to use it, and to be clear about expectations is a much better way to be. And if you intend to engage staff in shared decision-making, and we want them to approach survivors in that same way of, you tell me what's working for you, and here's some options. Let me think about how we can work together. And you want staff to behave that way, we need to model it. So again, we have all of these values. How are we showing up is important to think about. And so when we understand trauma, part of what we need to hold is that there are many sources of traumatic experience and trauma responses. So if we think about this circle, the outside, or the inside one, as your self-identity, everybody has a way that we identify ourselves, whether it's related to the pronouns we choose to use, whether we talk about race and ethnicity, whether we talk about parenting, whether we talk about being from the community that we're actually working in right now. Like, all of those are pieces of identity, and there are many, many more, right? The outside circle speaks to, do we have access and do we feel connection to other people that we trust? And so you can have that. And then there's experiences that disrupt that sense of identity and can disrupt that sense of trust. So we first think about traumatic historical experience, so genocide, enslavement, the things that have happened over generations, the ways that immigrants may be treated when they navigate, just trying to survive every day in this country. What does that look like? What's the history of that? And what's the present of that, right? So important that those can be sources of trauma. And we may not be thinking about those sources of trauma in our work, because when you work in domestic violence, you expect the trauma to be related to domestic violence. When you work in sexual assault, advocacy, you're expecting that the trauma people experience is related to sexual assault. And all of these other sources of trauma are also in the mix. And these are accumulating harms that happen. And then we have experiences with interpersonal violence. So that is domestic violence, sexual assault, other kinds of violent crimes, things that human beings do to one another that cause harm, can cause disconnection from yourself or being able to trust other people. Then there's what's happening in our communities at present. So that larger picture, are there hate crimes? Are there shootings? And our community is expansive, right? So, I find myself deeply impacted today, by the war in Ukraine. That even that's so far away, there's an impact that I'm feeling and things that have come up, which may have contributed to why I didn't sleep at all last night, right? So it's thinking about our communities, whether it's our immediate, what's outside our doorstep, to what's in our internet, to what's in our family circles. All of that is community. And then there are ways that people behave within our organizations and attitudes that people have that are disconnecting and disrupting. And so we have to think about that. Are there ways that we treat each other? Are there policies that we have that lead to further disconnection and trauma? And the answer to that is yes. So we hope to eliminate that. That takes work. It takes this journey that you're all on. It takes persistence. It takes tenacity to continually be thinking about, are there things that we do, ways that we view people that are causing harm? And so with that backdrop, we have to think about what's the impact of those stressors. So regular stress, tolerable stress, stress we experience every day can shift you away from emotional balance and what's predictable, and it calls on the system to restore itself. And so what that means is, if I didn't get sleep last night, I'm feeling a little off my game today, or I'm feeling stressed today, I'm going to work to restore that balance later. I may take a nap this afternoon. I have extra snacks with me. I'm going to drink extra beverage while we're talking today. There are things that I can do that I feel are in my control to counter the stress in the moment. Traumatic stress is different. Traumatic stress shifts people away from emotional safety, shifts you away from what feels predictable, shifts you away from what feels trustworthy, but it also prevents the system from restoring that balance. And so trauma responses are disruptive. And when we're coping and trying to sort through how do we survive this traumatic stress, because that's what those responses are, they're survival based, right? Then we have to pay attention and we have to notice. And sometimes when we're expecting each other to just get over something, we're sliding over, glossing over that what the person experienced may be traumatic. In supervision, there's a role to address traumatic stress. What happens in our organizations when those stressors are big and they're out there, right? That stress and trauma impact the staff who work there, and also in turn, the people who are using our services, accessing our services, can be impacted. Survivors have an acute sense of what's going on in the environment that doesn't feel quite right. So their survival has depended on having that sense of knowing something is coming. There's something in the water. There's something in the mix. There's something in the air that signals that the person I'm with is harmful. And maybe survivors may be doing everything they can in that moment to protect themselves. What happens in services is that acute sense of, that radar for, is working, and they notice that impact. So when our whole organization is not working towards being accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed, we're missing things that survivors are sensing in their day-to-day because of their resilience, because of their survival. So when we have stress and trauma that impact our organizations, we know it's going to impact survivors. And so we have to address the impact on survivors. We have to address the impact on staff who are doing the work. And we have to look at trauma within our entire organization and say, how are we impacted? And have those conversations. So another resource that I want to recommend to folks is guide number 1 for implementation support. And the focus of that particular guide, and it's available on the center's website if you all have not had it sent to you, which means if I didn't send it to you, that it addresses organizational trauma and the impact of organizational trauma on the organizational climate, or what it feels like to do this work. So I'm going to write that down as one of our resources to make sure that you all have access to. Okay. Right. So trauma-informed supervision serves a very specific purpose. What we're trying to do is increase self-awareness. So one of the things that happened in our small activity on just kind of checking in on our values is just to raise that self-awareness. So many of us go through the day and may not ever pause to think about, oh, that one thing, or somebody said something or did something that really rubbed us the wrong way, and what might that be? So I want us all to be aware of those things. The role of supervision is to teach skills, to offer support and motivation, particularly around navigating challenges, and also to support resilience, and then addressing trauma as it arises in the work. And what we want to do is to be sure that we're not contributing to re-traumatization and re-victimization of people who have already experienced harms. And that is both for survivors and for folks doing the work. So I'd like to, at this point, take a 15-minute break. And when we come back, we will take a deeper look into some of the other ingredients, and we'll go forward from there.
Wonderful, thanks, Cathy. So we'll see everybody back at 10:40 our time.
Yes.
Thank you all for doing that. Looks like a lot of folks are back.
Great. Thanks, Brandy. So as we talk about supervision in light of trauma, given the impacts of trauma, that trauma occurs over the lifespan for many, many, many of us doing this work, and from all the sources we've talked about. So in our supervisory relationship, the things we need to offer are real choices, really experiencing respect, that who we are as a whole person is welcomed in our work environment. So cultural resonance really does mean exactly that. It's how do we make sure that no one feels they have to leave part of themselves at home and to show up to do a good job. So all of who we are is welcomed in the space, how we identify, support for that, understanding, people learning if there's something to learn about, and we all have things to learn about one another. So it's not just thinking about who's different from me, it's how do we all learn about each other's differences and uniqueness, and also have space where we can be ourselves. without being called out for being too much. As a Black woman, that's something I've experienced on many occasions. You know, it's like, oh, if you raise your voice or you speak too loud or you say this thing, then, you know, somehow that's wrong. And so we've got to be able to make sure that our space does that we have shared responsibility for decisions, and everyone is not comfortable with that shared responsibility. And so part of it is creating an environment where we make that the way we work, that we're empathetic, that we make sure everyone is heard, and that we all behave in trustworthy ways. So that's part of the organizational culture and climate. So the organizational culture is, this is how we do things. The organizational climate is, this is how it feels here while we work. So I'm going to ask everyone to write down 3 qualities that you bring to your work. And this is for you, and they can be any 3 qualities, and try to get them to 1 word. So what I mean by that is I'm empathetic, I have good follow through, and I'm conscientious. Those might be my words. Or I'm helpful, I'm clear-headed, I'm a go-getter, and whatever word that means to me. So everyone write down 3 words that you have. And then point to the one that's most important. What's your most important quality? This might be a quality that other people see and say, yep, that Brandy is so caring, or Miranda is so helpful in this, right? In this particular way. So think about yourself. You should have 3 words that you've written down, and then circle the one that's most important.
I just want to check in. I saw Michelle McKay, you have your hand raised. Was that just to let us know you were here, or did you have a question?
No, I know I was just saying I'm here.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to make sure.
Okay, I get that off. Okay.
All right. And if everybody could please put your 1 word in the chat. Just whatever that word is, your 1 quality. So if you have 3 qualities, I asked you to circle the one that was most important, or notice the one that's most important, and put that 1 word that's your best quality in the chat. And it's totally okay to brag about yourself a little bit here. Love it. Integrity, supportive, understanding. Great. Passionate. Love it, love it, love it. All right. So hold that in mind as we have this next conversation. We all have ways that we prefer to show up at work, with our skills, with our talents, things we're passionate about, contributions we want to make. And then there are so many things that as staff that are impacting us. So what impacts staff? So certainly microaggressions and other kinds of inequities that are taking place in the workplace can be othering, can be disorienting, can be harmful, can be all of those things. Many of us have personal experiences and responses. And so those are personal experiences with violence and trauma, and then our own responses to those things. And so that might, if you think about a typical trauma response, might be fight or flight or freeze. And so when we have histories of trauma and we have trauma responses that we may or may not be aware of, that can show up in our work when we're feeling unsafe at work. So those experiences and responses. There might be trauma reminders as part of those experiences. So for me, there's certain smells. I was abused as a child in my community, and there are certain smells that I just can't do. It's the combination of musty basement, cigarette smoke, and human sweat. That those smells are a trauma reminder for me, and I didn't know it until I actually had a reaction at a time when I wasn't planning to, wasn't expecting to, didn't know anything about it. And then it took me a couple of months to figure out, why did I run away? Why did I run away? Dropped everything I was carrying. I ran down the hall. I ran down the steps, dropped everything I had, and was in my car with no memory of going from that hallway to my car. And my car was parked on the street in front of the house. So it's those kinds of things that, no one can control that for everybody, right? There are all kinds of trauma reminders. We can't always know what they are, and they do impact us. Whether we're doing the work or receiving services, trauma does not select us out, right? Because we're staff, right? We are impacted. Secondary trauma is an impact. And what secondary trauma is trauma that the experience was not yours personally, but it was someone else's experience. And because we show up with care and compassion, and we're so open and available and present, we're often impacted by other people's pain. And it doesn't make them bad people, or we're bad workers for, being susceptible. It's the nature of trauma. And what I like to say is, yes, trauma does that. So whether it's historical and collective, we're experiencing microaggressions, we have our own personal experiences, or secondary trauma, all of this is in the mix and impacting anyone at any given time. And then we have other kinds of issues that show up in the work that impact the work. So do we have the organizational capacity to do what we're doing? And so the pandemic is a perfect example of how lots of things changed, lots of things needed to change quickly. We didn't have all the answers as we're trying to make changes, and that those impacts were stressful. Some of the outcomes have been actually helpful. We learned how to do things in different ways. And at the same time, there were losses, there was grief, there was so much that impacts how we're able to show up and provide the services we're here to provide. Like, do we have the capacity to do it? Role expectations change. Sometimes people have not been clear about what their roles are, or that you're
for the Saturday thing. Again, it's
or you're hired to do a particular thing, but then that changes because of necessity. Many of us are working short-staffed, or we're onboarding new staff. There's all kinds of turnover and reasons for turnover. And in most places, there was more of that in the last 2 years. So did our roles change because of funding? Did our roles change because of staffing? Am I doing some extra things, or are we working in different ways? Sometimes what will happen is that we have someone who works so hard that when they leave and we have to hire someone new, we realize, oh wait, that person was doing the job of 2 or 3 people. And so we have to keep that in mind. And all of those things can contribute to stress and burnout. So stress is naturally occurring. And as we talked about earlier, sometimes stress just motivates us to navigate things in a different way. But when we are burned out, we're finding fault with the organization, with the funding, with the work we do. And those are the times when we often hear, oh wait, nobody cares as much as me, or no one is working as hard as I am, or no one is doing this the right way. And there's all kinds of variations in the language. But stress and burnout are impacting folks all the time. And what can happen is a stress contagion or a burnout contagion if the reason for the stress and burnout isn't alleviated. And so some of it, it's it's the work, it's the nature of the work. Other times it's things that can be controlled, but aren't necessarily shifting or changing in ways that are supportive. So all of these things are impacting staff. So when we're not meeting in supervision, we're not having these conversations. Or if we're not having like some of the bigger conversations that are impacting everyone, those are good staff meeting topics or work group topics. But if we're not doing those things, then we're not unraveling or unpacking the impacts of trauma on staff. This is from the work of Pat Vivian and Shana Horman, and it just speaks so well to the work we do in this field that people are attracted to this work for a reason. There's something that draws us to the work, and it may be our own histories, our own trauma. There's a something, right, that drives us, that says, this is where we want to be. I can make a contribution. And then there's the work itself. Some of us find it really rewarding, even when it's so super stressful. Some of us can find it life-changing. Some of us find it really difficult, but we're passionate about it. All of those things can be true. So when an individual is connected to the work and it's going well, that's great. But when it's not going well, or the organizational culture is not feeling and not providing the information about how we do it here, and the climate is intense, that there's the intensity that develops can be othering. So it can feel like I'm the only person who's doing this, I'm the only person who cares. And so when this level of intensity around the work goes unaddressed and unnamed, then the intensity gets bigger and broader and deeper. Just wanted to pause there and see if there are any questions, thoughts, or comments.
Cathy, hi, my name is Rachel, and I have a question. Well, maybe a question or a comment, and maybe you'll cover this, and I'm asking way too early. But
that's okay. Go ahead.
When you were talking back about the stress and burnout, when you're at that stage, I mean, are we looking? I've always heard that once you're at burnout, there's really not much to do except leave the organization, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on that and think how does one address when they are at burnout?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and so I've heard that, I've said that, and I think it's frequently the case. It's not always the case. Sometimes people can find a different role within the organization where they feel like they can still make a contribution, that they can give and receive the support and have the participation that makes sense. But so often when people are at the stage where they are experiencing burnout and they're invested in it, and like you're feeling it, you're naming it, you're talking about it, because there's such a negativity that builds around the person, and the negativity is all related to the work itself. So it's not just, I had a hard time with that person today, and that could be a colleague or working with a survivor, right? It's not just that. It's nothing is going well. The way we're funded doesn't work. The things we say we're working on don't work. Our values don't work. So when people are building that kind of a case against the organization, they often find the only relief is to leave. Or if they stay, that contagion can spread and kind of poison the well for everyone. And so what you want to think about is, one, really cultivating self-awareness and having ways of talking in supervision with staff, giving feedback, talking about what's coming up in the work, and how they're navigating it, right? And so when you can have those kinds of conversations, it's more possible that the person can find some relief. Typically, if somebody says out loud that they're leaving, and usually how those conversations, people are venting. I hate it here, I'm leaving, we're not doing good work, whatever that looks like for folks, whatever that language is, once they start to say those things out loud, they do eventually go, because part of it is that they've named an exit strategy and they've talked about it with people who either are reminders of what they said or will remind them directly about what they said. And so it makes it harder to stay. But also when someone is that deeply negative about the organization, about the work, about their colleagues, about leadership, about supervision, about all of it, then they're not going to be bringing their best selves to interactions with survivors. And so the first step is never, well, maybe you should go. That's not ever going to be the first step. The first step is always conversation, thinking about education, thinking about support, thinking about what does staff need right now in terms of direction. All of that is all stuff to try. But if the person is not willing to try, they're not willing to try new things, they're not willing to think about things differently, then it's a different kind of conversation. It's what's holding you here. Because something is holding you back from doing good work. And if it's interfering with survivors' health and well-being, then that for me is the deal breaker, right? As a supervisor, that's the deal breaker. So we then have to have real talk about, well, where do we go from here? Sometimes people choose to leave on their own and some people are invited to leave. And I think that in this field, because turnover is high and because it's hard to find folks that are committed to this work, who have experience doing this work, who can stay connected and, be comfortable with chaos and can navigate, people in their pain. Like those are skill sets. And so it's hard to find folks with those kinds of skill sets sometimes, given our communities or where we are, or where we're located, or our funding, what are the salaries like? All of those things contribute, right? So you don't want to just say, if you're not happy here, you ought go. You want to try to work on some strategies. You want to give feedback. You want to be supportive. You want to provide options. You want to do lots of things that we'll continue to talk about. But when folks are in that negative space and they're spreading that negativity, doing nothing contributes to contagion. So at the minimum, you have to give people feedback about how they're showing up, what your experience of them is, and work on a plan for change. And some folks can make that shift and others can't. And thank you for the question. And so some of the things to think about are on the front end, how do we get ahead of those impacts? So thinking about resilience, thinking about well-being for everyone, not just for service participants, but what are we doing to support staff well-being? And so that's another question for reflection for each and every one of you. What are the organizational strategies to support staff, given all of the things they're experiencing and the impacts of those experiences? So what do we have for time off? What do we have for paid time off? What do we have as options? What kind of flexibility is there? I think the pandemic put us in a place of really needing to be highly flexible. And so how do we keep continuing with that mindset around flexibility to give staff what they need to continue to do this work? And so the balance to that is we need staff to do the work. The work with survivors still needs to be done. So how do we do that and best support staff while they're doing that? And that's not easy, but it's an organizational conversation. Questions, thoughts, comments, anybody? And again, thank you, Rachel. As we move forward with the training, I would like you to have a supervisory challenge in mind. Write it on a piece of paper, write it on an index card, put the person's initials next to it so that it's real to you. And in our follow-up sessions, you'll have a worksheet where you can actually write down a challenge and then apply the skill to the challenge. And so I just want to start that process of really having something in mind. I'm not going to ask you to share anything today that you're uncomfortable sharing. I'm not going to ask you even our follow-up sessions. You can identify a challenge, but if you don't want to share outward about it, that's totally okay too. But I want you to have some scaffolding or a place to apply what you're learning and what you're thinking about and reflecting on. The next handout we're going to be looking at, so folks can gather that, are questions that encourage problem solving. We will be using this handout in our follow-up session, so just please make sure that you keep it handy with you, and that when we start from strengths and when we try to work in problem-solving ways or a solution-focused orientation, what that does is provide opportunities for collaboration. And for staff, even when we have to give critical feedback, to have a foundation of knowing that we also see their strengths. So if we're only critical, if we only offer feedback when somebody majorly messes up on something, then what happens is they can become uncertain about even their strengths. So they'll start to wonder if there are other things that they're not doing correctly or not doing, the way it needs to be done according to your organizational culture. They may question whether they belong. So sometimes the way we name strengths and engage staff in finding solutions in a collaborative way can counter all of those sources of burnout. So all of the things that we talk about in terms of skills to bring are here and named here because they counter burnout. They counter people feeling othered. They counter people feeling uncertain. They counter people feeling like they're the only one who cares. And so these are named this way on purpose. So let's talk a little bit about strengths. So in the same way I asked each and every one of you to think of your qualities, I would love for you to have this conversation with staff. And the way that you do it is similar to what we did here. Asking every person to name their 3 qualities they bring to their work. And if you're doing this in person during a staff meeting, encircle the 1. And the conversation to have with them is to ask them to share at the table a time when the quality they circled was present and who got to see it, who witnessed it, who noticed, and just have that conversation to be able to share strengths. So many of us are taught not to brag about ourselves. And if you're trying to create a culture of learning and growing together, we need to be able to share the strengths so that when we share the places that people still need to grow, it doesn't feel demeaning or minimizing. It's not a shock because we can talk about it. So when you think of staff, I'm sure there are staff that you're saying to yourself, oh yeah, that person, they have all these qualities. And the staff that we feel good about spending time with, the staff that have the qualities that we value, are the folks that we tend to seek out, but also ask to do more. The folks who have learning and growing to do, because those relationships may be challenging, we tend to avoid them. And so it's really naming for each and every staff person what are the qualities that you see as well. So let's talk about this a little bit more. When a challenge comes up, we have ways of either just responding in the moment. So in a crisis, when a challenge presents itself, and a crisis would be someone is ill, there's blood, there's, an accident, there's an injury, that's that kind of crisis, right? In those spaces, we might need to be more directive. Okay, this is what we need to do. Do this, do this, do this. When it's not a crisis, we need to figure out ways to engage staff by, one, noticing and naming their strengths, and also saying, let's figure this out together. So when someone comes to supervision, or if you're meeting with somebody and there's a problem, it could be something pretty routine. We're short-staffed, and I needed to go with someone for an appointment. In that situation, while it's important and it's urgent, it is not a crisis. What happens in this field, and in a few others, everything that happens is viewed as a crisis. And then we are expected to respond as leaders to that same urgency. So one of the skills we need to be really comfortable doing is to separate out what's important from what's a crisis and what might not be important at all. And to take time for the things that are important to solve together. And so what tends to happen, because survivors are experiencing crisis, when we meet them, we're meeting them because there's crisis in their lives. There's a lack of safety. There's definite urgency. And we have resources and supports that can be helpful. That does not mean that we need to be in crisis too. So it's calming things down. So, and the term I like to use is calm clarity. And so we can ask people questions around the incident or whatever's come up. We can ask staff, what ideas do you have for a solution? And so even if we're talking about, needing to be in two places at once, let's figure out what's the priority, who can we engage, who else can we call? And so, yes, these conversations do take more time, but what we're doing when we do that are increasing staff skills to engage in problem solving as a collaborative partner. And so the ways we ask questions and the kinds of questions we ask matter. So it's making sure that we can do this cross-culturally, cross-racially, cross-generationally, and that sometimes the way we ask questions can be disrespectful. So one of the questions that I know always puts me on tilt a little bit is when people say, what'd you do that for? Now, there was a point in my life when someone asked me that, and it was incredibly helpful because it was someone who was a survivor, who was not part of the organization I was working in, and who was calling me out and said, why did you make this decision? What was behind this decision? What did you do that for? And that led to some learning for me. But other times when someone has said, what did you do that for? Or why'd you make that decision? It feels by the tone that there's shame in it and I was all kinds of wrong. And so that doesn't engage folks to be part of problem solving. So if you look at the questions that encourage problem solving, and we will use this in our future sessions, there are all kinds of questions that we can use. And so what I would ask you to do is spend some time with this. When you need clarification, ask clarifying questions. When you want to encourage somebody to describe something more, or to encourage them to evaluate it, or to encourage looking at different perspectives, to identify challenges, to use information, to plan differently, there are sample questions that can help you with that. And so while this is not the be-all, end-all of questions, it's a really good start for changing the way we engage staff when problems and challenges come up. Any thoughts or comments, anybody, as you look at the questions or as you're thinking about this? Okay. The next set of conversation is around being very, very clear, and we want staff to do. Staff need to know what to expect. And sometimes what we do is, we toss people into the deep end of the pool and say swim. And, we try to do onboarding, but if we're short staffed, then we might miss something. Or we may have to rush through something because I need to be in 2 places at once, so I need somebody to help cover something that they might have an experience with. So it makes sense that situations come up where there's a lack of clarity, but what we want to strive for is absolute clarity. Thinking about ways that we have job descriptions and that we actually use them. So one very specific task that a supervisor can do is actually review a job description with someone who's been working for a while. Is this what you're doing? Does this describe what you're doing? Competencies are skills. And so you have a handout that's labeled sample competencies, and we're going to take a look at that while we have this conversation. Okay, so what do you have in place? Like, are people in your organization, people you supervise, are they clear about their roles? Do they have questions? Do you have a clear approach to supervision? Is it, once a week, every other week? Is it an hour for each person? Do you have a way of checking in with folks on how they're doing and then addressing any challenges that are coming up? What's the conversation in your supervisory session? Do people know what's expected from the work that they're doing? So, just as an example, if someone is doing community outreach and they've never done a community outreach meeting, so they're in the community, they're talking about your organization, and they've never done it before, they need to know what to expect. They need to know what to bring. They need to know what to talk about, but they also need to know what a good job looks like when they're done. So defined outcomes is really the piece around, do they know what the results should be? And so often, staff are not prepared for that. And that's part of staff development. And it's on us as supervisors to provide that development. Are we clear about the competencies or skills that people need? So if you take a look at that list of competencies, if we are wanting all staff to be able to have an understanding of the impact of oppression on our organization, on survivors we work with, and on staff that are doing the work, how is that happening? That's a set of skills. That awareness is a skill set. Who's doing the teaching? How is it that staff are able to talk about what they know and don't know? Is there a safe space to talk about what they know and don't know? So that's an example of a skill. We expect advocates, for example, to know the legal system and what's required around someone who's seeking a protective order. And that's really common in our work. We expect advocates to know how to safety plan. That's also a set of skills for this work. So we need to make sure that we're teaching it, not just expecting people to, luck into it, right? We want folks to learn it the way we do it here in our organization, and then work towards that. And then when they're good at it, we can name those strengths. If they're struggling with it, we can name it as an area for continued growth and learning. I also wonder about performance evaluations and whether or not y'all do them. And so if you could put in the chat how often you do performance evaluations. Is it annual? Is it every 6 months? Is it after 90 days or after 30 days and then a year after that? So whatever your process is for performance evaluations, if you could go ahead and name that and share that. Part of the reason for a performance evaluation is so people can grow their skills or their competencies. And what tends to happen in many organizations, we do performance evaluations once a year, and then we don't look at them again until next year. And so there's not an active sense of working on those particular skills. So people that I supervise, an approach that I've used for quite a long time now is that every single person has a staff development plan. So yes, I do performance evaluations and that are 360. I also want people to evaluate me and my supervisory approach. And does that work for them, not work for them? How am I doing with that? How are my leadership skills? I want to hear from staff about that. But the staff development plan also names these are things that staff are working on. And so that is in your handouts, and we'll use it in our follow-up sessions for sure. But that when every staff person has one, then it's an equitable thing that we can point to in our organization is that we are all working on areas for growth, including me. Any thoughts or comments about that?
I have a question, Cathy. What I struggle with, and we're really looking at our evaluation process at our organization. And what I struggle with, just being in the work that we do, is that evaluations, our raises, annual raises are based and tied to evaluations, which feels very power and controlish for me. And trying to explain that to the higher ups and executive who maybe don't do the work that we do, and I see it from a different lens. Yep. And I just struggle with that because I feel like, you know, I'm setting my staff up for expectations that are based on someone, whoever designated the scoring system. Like if 3 is the expectation, I mean, it just, I struggle with that and want to be able to offer something that doesn't feel so, if you do X, Y, and Z, you're going to get, you know, a raise that is. So I don't know. I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. And thank you for raising the struggle. And I so appreciate that, the mindset that you have around it, right? So if we think about this, we can be unclear about people's roles and responsibilities. People could be being evaluated on things that they're actually not doing at work. And so all of this does line up. And it's really important to use an evaluation process where staff are contributing for themselves how they are doing in their work. And it is much more helpful when a different kind of strategy is used for raises and that compensation, right? So if we're really thinking about what's equitable, if you're doing the work, then we need to be paid for doing the work. If we're not doing the work, we should be getting feedback about how the work needs to get done and it needs to improve. And so it is not a rule that raises are tied to evaluations. That's an organization's choice, and that can be changed. There are also different kinds of evaluations out there and different strategies for doing evaluation. So one of the things we did in one of the organizations where I worked is we asked all the advocates to look at a list of competencies or skills and say, do you do this in your work? Is this part of your work? Not whether or not you're good at it, but is this part of your work or not part of your work? And what we learned is that so many things on those standardized evaluations are not part of the work that people are actually doing. And so creating a different evaluation and creating a different evaluation process was helpful. And the items came from the work that people were actually doing rather than this package of things that we got from someplace else. And so that was a helpful process. But then we also had to change the way we talk about evaluations. And so what we did is there was an evaluation at 90 days for new employees. And then we did one at the 6-month mark, and then after that it was annual. And so one of the things that would happen is that we'd look at those competencies, we'd talk with staff about, here's the form, here's the evaluation, go ahead and evaluate yourself. I'm going to also do an evaluation, and when we meet, that's the conversation we're going to have. We stopped tying it to money. We tied it to the goals that people worked on to get better at their jobs. And everyone got raises when raises were due. We did cost of living increases rather than these merit-based raises that were so subjective. And, you know, the other piece that is real is that very often in this work, the salaries are not as high as people could make elsewhere. So if we want people to stay in the field, then we need to get creative about the evaluations we use, the way we do cost of living, looking at salaries to make sure they're equitable in terms of, you know, what are the jobs that people are doing and does this make sense? And so it's a bigger conversation than just the evaluation, but I do know there are organizations who stop tying merit-based raises to annual evaluations and just did it differently. And so it's looking at the whole package of the kind of benefits we offer and what do we offer staff and around their well-being. So all of this comes together like ingredients in a soup. And whatever processes we do have, making sure that we have documents that spell it out in policy and that name the competencies that are needed for this work, and being clear in supervision about discussing the goals that people have. What we tend to do is supervise for the crisis at the moment rather than what are you working on? What are you working towards and how's that going? How can I support you in this? How much direction do you need from me in this?
Cathy, this is Brandy. We did have a question come up in the chat about, and you shared some handouts and also the information you just shared might also kind of answer this a little bit, but there is a question about good resources out there for performance evaluations and staff development plans. Are there other resources that you might have?
So staff development plans, I have a blank that I use all the time, and it's based on the ingredients of effective supervision. So when we talk about staff development, we're definitely going to use that in our follow-up session. So that's there. I think I don't have a specific evaluation that I could recommend. I think that's something that's an ask to put out to the field, and I'm happy to do that if you like. And I'm writing myself a note. And so we can put an ask out to the field. And I mean, some folks, I know right before the pandemic, were starting some new processes and then felt, you know, disrupted and all of that because of the pandemic. So, you know, again, definitely happy to ask. One thing I would add to that is sometimes as part of kind of really looking at staff development, looking at how we best work, some organizations are using preference tools or preference inventories. So the Myers-Briggs is one of those preference inventories. There are others. And so the idea here is to use, a tool that can help people sort out what aspects of the work do they do well, what are their preferences for doing the work, what are their strengths, and that using that kind of a tool or resource, before starting even an evaluation process can be really helpful. And so again, lots of organizations have used the Myers-Briggs. StrengthsFinder is another one that's really pretty common. It's also pretty good for team building. So just to name those resources. And if I hear about any specific evaluation that folks have liked, that they didn't create themselves or have something that they're willing to share, I'll share it back with each and every one of you. And so this we've talked about in terms of staff needing clear processes. So when things are predictable and staff can count on that predictability, then they can count on us as supervisors. And so one of the things that happens regularly is that folks will schedule a supervision meeting and then something comes up and it's quickly canceled. And so one of the recommendations I make is that hold supervision appointments, those times to meet, hold them sacred. And the other strategy I use is that every meeting, I give the person the dates of our next 2 meetings. So what I want to do is build in predictability and build in routine. So if we meet every Tuesday at 9 o'clock, then when we meet on Tuesday, at the end of our meeting, I'm going to just come back to, we're all set. We'll meet again next Tuesday at 9 o'clock and the Tuesday after that at 9 o'clock. Just want to make sure you have it in your plans. Is there anything that comes up that might prevent us from getting together? So here's the thing. Sometimes staff will cancel meetings, or you start to notice a pattern where they're in court, or this came up, or that came up and they're out. Something is going on, and that's an indicator that staff need more contact, not less. So when staff start to cancel meetings, that for me is a signal that we need to reschedule it as soon as possible. I usually try the same day or the next day if staff cancel a meeting. If I cancel it, same thing. I want to get together as soon as possible. And again, that time is held sacred, because what I want is consistency and predictability, because that's how you start to build trustworthiness when it's not there. And it sometimes takes so little to disrupt trust, right? So important to do everything we can. So think about what you do and where your own growth areas might be. And because this comes up a lot, I want us to be thinking about that uncomfortable and unsafe are not the same thing. And while I want everyone to feel safe at work, I also recognize that sometimes people don't. I also know that sometimes people will use the word unsafe or say, I don't feel safe, to avoid confrontation, to avoid getting feedback, or to avoid accountability. And so because I'm not a mind reader and I really don't have a crystal ball, what I try to talk about is really very clearly, when someone says, I'm not comfortable, I'll say, so what needs to happen right now to create some comfort so we can have this conversation? Sometimes people want to just sit somewhere else, get a drink of water, take a walk. If someone says, I don't feel safe having this conversation, then we need to talk about, so what can we do to create that sense so that we can have the conversation? Because it might be uncomfortable, but I'm not here to harm you. So let's talk about what that looks like. So some programs have put into place in their personnel policies that when a staff person has a grievance, for example, they can ask for mediation with a neutral party. And that's a way that they've built in some safety. Sometimes an organization has said, or a supervisor has said, and it's in the policies, that you can bring a colleague. So I can't breach confidentiality around staffing issues. I'm only going to talk to staff. But if they choose to bring a colleague into a supervisory meeting, then they're choosing to share whatever that challenge might be. So it's a conversation for you all to have at your organizations, to have with your board of directors, to really take a look at what's in our policies that supports people feeling more safe. And if you do not have human resources department, one of the things that you'll need to look at is to make sure that you don't have staff who are responsible for supervision, who are also responsible for the human resource functions, because that creates a conflict of interest. And I know that that's been a strategy for a number of programs. So human resources needs to be a separate function so that it can create that possibility for, if someone is not feeling respected, not feeling safe, not feeling that they're being heard, that they don't have a voice, and they've tried and they've done everything they can do internally to do it, where is their resource for conversation? And so it's creating that balance and figuring out, how do we do that where we're still getting our work done? And by still getting our work done, what I mean is to have space for those kinds of conversations and still paying attention to why we're here, to meet survivors' needs. And that's a tough thing, because it's hard to drink from an empty cup. And if you're feeling, and staff are feeling, that they're not cared for, they're not respected, they're being oppressed, then it's hard to focus on the work. And so we need to look at all of that as the whole picture, and how do we have that conversation? And so, again, having HR functions is helpful. Having the person who does HR function not be supervisor for anyone is helpful. Being able to be really clear in your policies about what supervisors' roles are. A supervisor's role is to give feedback. It is to correct and work on correcting problematic behavior. That while we all have good intentions, we're not all doing the right thing. And so there are realities to that. And so again, we work in these hierarchical organizations. Let's try to make that as comfortable as we can, knowing that it fits like an itchy shirt. So if you're not working in a collective, there's a hierarchy. And so there are things we can do. We can have collaborative decision making. We can name the kinds of decisions we are making. So for example, for a supervisor to say, I would like to get everyone's input so that I can make a decision about this thing. So that's a kind of decision making, right? I'm gathering input, I'm going to take it all in and then make a decision. Or I want to have everyone's consensus, reach consensus about this thing. That's a very different kind of decision making. And so we don't want to say we want to reach consensus if that's not what we're doing. If I have formal authority and I'm going to use my formal authority and make a decision, I need to be transparent about that. I need to say, this is what we're doing. This is what I'm doing. I definitely want to know the impacts of what I'm doing. And so again, supervision is a relationship, and we need to be thinking about how to hold, care for staff, and doing the work that we need to do, and doing that as honestly, clearly, and transparently as we possibly can. When things don't feel equitable, so as a staff of color, I may be feeling like, wait, I'm being treated in a way that is different. than what other people are experiencing. I need to be able to go to human resources and say, this is a problem, and I need to feel heard about that. And so we need to look at our policies and practices, and what do our policies say about how we're navigating those kinds of things. And so those are important, and maybe important policy changes to make if that's not what your policies are offering. But the important piece is having the conversation about it and engaging staff in the conversation about it. The handout that you have on skills and competencies, I would like you to take a look at. And we're going to do a 5-minute breakout. So that handout has a list of competencies, and it also has a couple of questions on the bottom about how would you make those competencies more specific to your organization? What's one idea for that? And also, what would there be supervisory competencies that you would want to have added to this list? So Brandy, can you go ahead and do breakout groups?
Yes, we are in the process of sending folks to breakout rooms.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay. All right, I think everybody landed. Thank you all, welcome back. Don't forget to mute and turn off your video, thank you.
All right. So any thoughts or comments about your conversation? I do realize it was brief. Anything that y'all feel needs to be shared out with a larger group?
I think we just talked about how it's really important for a supervisor to also understand these competencies and also maintain them and use them as well in order to effectively supervise your advocate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have to know a little something, especially if you're onboarding staff and supporting staff. You have to know a little bit about their lives and their work so that what we're giving people feedback on is consistent with the work they're actually doing, right? So thank you.
Yeah, this is Jenny. And I also think that it's really important for whatever the competencies are, not only to be explained and spelled out and reviewed frequently, but that the supervisors have some idea of what exists if that staff member has something that they've identified to encourage them or promote them to increase their understanding. So I think that the whole picture needs to be understood by the person that's providing that supervision.
I agree. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. Any other thoughts, anyone? So when we look at the next grouping of ingredients is really, they're all related to accountability, which is exactly what you were just talking about, Jenny, in terms of actually both comments, that leaders need to be accountable for the functions of supervision. So you need to support, you need to do the administration, and you need to educate. And then when staff are struggling with something, supervisors need to be able to name what a good job looks like, or if some improvement is needed, what is needed. And we need to be able to share that. It doesn't mean that I, as a supervisor, have to know how to do everything, but I need to know how to do quite a lot. But I also need to be able to say, this person over here, if it's not me, this person does a really good job at that. Let's see if we can get you some time together so you can talk about what the challenges might be and what might work better. So I don't have to provide all of the education for everything for everyone, but I do need to know who can. So we need to have information. And so when we talk about supervisory accountability, you know, it's not enough to say this is the way it should be done, right? So we've talked a little bit around equity, but one of the things we know is a problem in our culture of organizations is perfectionism, and that there's only one way to do something. So someone might be really good at something, but have their own way to get it done. If it works, it's not my way or the highway. It's like, yeah, that works. Let's do it. If it doesn't work, then let me show you what's missing in this. And so again, a supervisor needs to have some information. And so we're to constantly counter and question, I guess. We have to question, are we truly a learning, growing organization? And is that the culture I'm trying to create here? Is that the climate? I want people to feel that it's okay to make mistakes, that we learn from those mistakes as we are learning and growing together. And that's a mindset that we can bring forward and use in many, many aspects of our work if we're willing and if we're open. Ways for supervisors to be accountable, to be transparent. One of the things that I talk about is preparation for supervision. I want to prepare myself as a supervisor, but I also want to prepare staff. So the worst supervisor I ever had, one of the gifts she did give me was that she would say, if you come with a problem, come with at least one idea for a solution. It might not be the one solution that works, but it does make it so that we're in this together. And so I had to be ready to share experiences as a staff, but as supervisors, we also have to be ready to share experiences. We have to be able to hear each other's perspectives. And so if we want staff to show up in these ways, we have to provide an orientation to our own supervisory process. Everybody needs to be ready for feedback. Supervisor needs to be ready. I need to be ready. And so that is how we work together, and that we're in this together. And that collaboration doesn't happen by magic. It happens because as a supervisor, we set a tone for this is how we're going to work together, and then we're consistent. We actually show up ready to collaborate. We show up ready to share. We show up holding ourselves accountable and modeling what accountability looks like, modeling what collaboration looks like. We model competence. Anything that you're wanting staff to do, we need to model it. If you want people to be accepting that none of us are perfect and we all make mistakes, we have to model that. If what we're doing is constantly having this kind of standard that is unrealistic and only works for one or two people, then we have to find other ways to get that piece of work done. If I want someone to increase their capacities to work with survivors who are struggling, let's say with mental health challenges, then I have to model my own flexibility, my own openness. I have to name, if something was scary, I need to name that, yeah, that was scary, but let's figure out how we can handle it so that we are more prepared next time. So I need to do that. If I respond to everything as if it's a crisis, then everyone's going to respond to everything as if it's a crisis, because that's the tone I'm setting. So we have to model things on purpose. So let's look at what we're modeling. Cultivating self-awareness, being honest, listening, being respectful, being kind, being transparent, being consistent, amplifying marginalized voices, expressing vulnerability, being able to say, I don't know, but let's work together and see what we can figure out. Holding self and others to expectations. So if I'm holding staff accountable, but I'm letting myself off the hook for things that are my responsibility, that's not helpful. But if I'm saying, this was mine to do, I take responsibility, and I've got to make space to get it done. That's accountability. So it's naming that I'm not always perfect, I'm not always right, and I'm willing to keep working at it. So this is how you model that stuff, and you create space for that stuff, and you provide an orientation and have conversation about what it means to be cultivating self-awareness. It means being reflective about our work. It means being open to feedback, but also being open to giving and receiving feedback, not just one way. As a supervisor, I don't just take feedback, I don't just give it, I also have to take it in. And can we create those kinds of environments? Are we willing to do that? So because of the time, and we got a little bit of a late start, I'm going to skip this conversation about preferred view, and I'm going to come back to it in our follow-up session. Some of it we've talked about already in terms of understanding and asking about qualities. The other things that we're going to do in our follow-up session is we're going to have a very deep conversation about giving and receiving feedback. We will do some practice of giving and receiving feedback, and also talk about the challenges of giving and receiving feedback. So giving looks like something, it's very specific. You're not walking down the hall past somebody and saying, oh, hey, great job about that. And then that's it. Giving feedback, whether it's critical or whether it's positive, requires a conversation with the person where you're focused on this feedback. That if we want staff to receive feedback in a way that's open, we need to provide an orientation to it. So any place I work, all of the staff have training on giving and receiving feedback, and we practice, all the staff. So what message that sends is, I'm open to receiving feedback from all of you. I'm also going to give feedback to all of you. And so power sharing looks like something, and it's making sure that when we're giving feedback, we're respectful, we're consistent. We link it, the challenge, if let's say we have to give critical feedback, you're linking it either to a challenge or to your values, or both. You're saying things like, well, because it's important for everyone to feel that they're being treated fairly, I'm going to give you this feedback that I've given to everyone about this particular issue. Or because we want to be clear about what people's growth areas, and everyone has an area where they're growing. I want to give you this feedback, and I'm going to be specific about it. And so you want to name the reason for the concern. And if the only reason you can come up with is because it's not how I do it, or because I said so, then that's not a time for you to give feedback. If you're angry, not a time for you to give feedback. You need to be clear and calm. You need to be able to link what needs to change to how it impacts survivors, how it impacts colleagues, how it impacts the program, how it's either in alignment with the values or not. That's what's important, is that anchor. And we want people to take in feedback, ask any questions they have. Don't make excuses for why I did this or that. But if they have real questions about, what's the approach to use, then we need to, as supervisors, be able to answer it. And so it goes back to that supervisory accountability. So we are going to have a much deeper conversation about giving and receiving feedback in our next session. The next ingredient is situational leadership, and that's an approach to staff development. We are going to have a full session on that. And you're going to be using a handout that I want to tell you about now so that you can think about it. It says leadership style self-assessment at the top. And then it says, which style do you prefer? And there are 4. One is pink, one is orange, one is purple, and one is green. And if before our next session, you can take a look at that and decide which of those is most like you, or most like the way you prefer to work, that will be helpful for that conversation on situational leadership. And so we'll talk quite a bit about that. That's the leadership style self-assessment. And then you have the slides. So of course you can look ahead, and I apologize for moving these slides fast. So I want to tell you about the very last ingredient is reflective practice. So we will have a situational leadership session, and we will have a reflective practice session. And so in each of those follow-up sessions, we'll be working with scenarios, you'll be working with your own challenges, and reflection is a way of talking through challenges where instead of just venting, we are working towards a different outcome. So next time you can do it differently. And so that's what we will do together. So I'm going to end our time together right here. And with this quote, I know there are strengths in the differences between us, and I know there is comfort where we overlap. And I thank each and every one of you for your time today. Apologize for our tech difficulties and our little bit of a late start, but also want to encourage you to, look at the materials. Anything that we're going to focus on in our next session, you'll get some information about that in the next day or two, so that you'll know where to focus and what we're going to be talking about when you join. Any last wishes, thoughts, comments? Anybody? We've got about a minute.
One thing that I wanted to share with y'all is that I want you to keep an eye out when we send out the handouts for next week. There might be a new registration link for that. So we need to resolve some tech things on our end, and want to just make sure you all, if you look at those new the new handouts, make sure you're seeing if there's a new registration link in there. So thank you for your patience with that.
Thanks, Brandy. Anything else, anyone, before we end today? I thank you all for your time and really appreciate you joining us. Have a good rest of your week.